I'm Dr. Jaime Module. Welcome to Module 7, Self-Sabotage. In the course, if you want to fly higher, you must be lighter. Self-sabotage is an important, tricky, wonderful thing to look at. For victims, it's easy to say, we were victimized, other people did something to us. For survivors, we may say people did things to us in the past, but the reality, I think, is that we continue to do things to ourselves to make our lives really difficult, really hard, really much more work than we want, than we really want, that are good for us. There's an old joke by Whoopi Goldberg that she talked about this woman who had moved to a new town and was really excited about her job, and she was going to have a new life and start exercising, and so she was going to walk from her home to her work, which wasn't too far, and it was going to get her out and get to know the city and on and on. So this was her routine every day, and she was happy, and she would walk across town and walk past this pet store. And in the pet store window, there was a parrot. And the parrot, as she walked by, would call out these insults to her, say, "You're ugly." And she heard that and continued walking and thought it was really unusual, and then walked back to her home after work, and the parrot's there and said, "You're fat." And she just thought, this is awful, but unusual. So she did this, every day, going back and forth to work. And the parrot would call out to her every day these insults. So at one point she went into the manager and said, this is really terrible and offensive, and I want you to get rid of this parrot. So manager put the parrot back in, farther into the pet store, not out in the front area. And she would continue to walk by, and whenever she walked by, she could be across the street, wherever, time of day, the parrot would call out to her, "You're fat, you're ugly." And little by little, she got furious. Right? And so she went up to the manager at one point and said, "I have this disturbing the peace public nuisance order that if your parrot continues to call out this stuff to me, we're going to have to put it down." And so the manager said, "I'm very sorry, and we'll take care of it." Put the parrot behind the desk there. And the next day, the woman walked past, and the bird was silent. And she walked past again, and the bird was silent. And she was still mad. So she walked into the store and saw the parrot and approached the parrot, and the bird was silent. And she got up right into the parrot's face and said, "Well, you got anything to say to me?" The parrot didn't say anything. He said, "Come on, what are you going to say?" The parrot said, "You know." And I love that, she had it in her head, right? She had internalized all this stuff. She was holding on to all this stuff that she didn't need the parrot to be unhappy, to be upset, and she knew, right? So this is the stinking thinking. This is the stuff that we can internalize that keeps ourselves crazy, that we project what other people are thinking, and we care too much about what other people are saying about us. There's another way of thinking about the self-sabotage that we do as survivors, because we're often reacting to the past without really seeing clearly what's in front of us. Portia Nelson has the story about life in 5 stages. It's called A Hole in the Sidewalk, and it's one of the videos that you have on this module. And day 1, in short, is a person who walks down a sidewalk, and there's a hole in the sidewalk, and they fall in. And they're upset, and it takes them a long time to get out. They didn't know what happened, and eventually they get out. The next day, they walk down the same sidewalk, and they know it's there, that the hole is there, but they pretend really to not notice, not know, and they fall in. And this time they're still mad, and it takes them a long, long time to get out because they're still not to blame, even though they knew. And they get out. The next day, they walk down the same sidewalk, and they know it's there, and they don't want to fall in, but they fall in anyway. But this time, they get out quickly, and they know it's their fault. The next day, they walk down the same sidewalk, and they walk around the hole. And the 5th day, they walk down another sidewalk. And so this is another way for me of thinking about how we may have been victimized, we may have been blindsided by things that happened in the past to us, but then we can pretend that that's not there, that doesn't have an impact, and that we really want what is good for us, but then we keep doing the same old things that are not so good for us. And it's a process for us sometimes to get out of denial, and other times to know that we have some issues, but we fall in anyway. But little by little, we start to react quicker. We respond quicker. We're more thoughtful, and eventually we can walk around. And so survivorhood, in my mind, is often that second and third day where we pretend that we're fine, and we fall into the same problems. And then we may really, really want to get out of that, and we may fall in, but at some point we start taking responsibility, and we get out, and we learn, and we make changes. So this is this module's focus is recognizing that we are our solution, that we can also be our worst enemy. We can also sabotage ourselves. So I want to talk a little bit about how that happens again, that we can be compassionate towards ourselves in this process and not just blame ourselves for making bad decisions. And then we can take some steps to recognize the ways that we're falling into that hole again and again. So let me just recognize that that sabotaging has come from somewhere. Vincent Felitti, in his study called the Adverse Childhood Experience Study, has made an incredible contribution to help us see the ways that bad experiences sometimes have added up, and sometimes, because of child sexual abuse in particular, have led to all kinds of internalized mental and physical problems. The study, in a nutshell, started off with dealing with obesity, and at some point he asked someone when their eating behavior changed, and that person said when someone started molesting him, whoever that was. And all of a sudden, he had ruined his study because he asked a new question. So he had to ask more and more people the same question, and he started to find out a high correlation to childhood sexual abuse and their physical weight and other kinds of health issues. And he also started to look at the ways that doctors have treated patients, and how doctors often look at symptoms and want to treat a disease, and patients often come to doctors looking for healing, for something deeper. They're not coming for a disease, but for some kind of problem with their wellness. And so Felitti looked at, in the 40s, methamphetamines were prescribed for depression. And he started seeing all these different patients who were currently dealing with all kinds of self-destructive and other destructive behaviors and addictions to stimulants and risky behaviors that would get people stimulated, as well as I have a lot of depressed people here. So if you remember in an earlier module, I had this emotional chart, victims, survivors, thrivers, and thrivers. And in those earlier stages, we went from depression, hopelessness, to rage, right? And so we want to recognize that often victims and survivors carry a lot of depression. And so we have to work through these different emotions as we reconnect with our background experiences. Because the self-destructive behavior isn't rational. Somebody who's got to make a life change, decision about smoking or all kinds of other things, may not do it because they're stuck in an addiction or in some kind of thinking that overrides would be the rational thing to do if I want to live a healthy life. Maybe that's day 2 and 3 of that Portia Nelson example. So we need to learn to self-manage. Other things have been managing us, other things have been triggering us, and we need to start to take responsibility for where we're going. There are a few ways we can think about this self-destructive behavior. We may not even recognize it. We may think that what we're doing is totally normal, and that is normal. We all think that we're good, and that other people are the problems when we get into conflicts or things don't go the way we want. There's an old adage, wherever you go, there you are. That we may keep changing places to work or relationships or whatever and keep finding the same dynamics because we're bringing that stuff with us. So we may not even recognize what we're doing. So this self-sabotaging kind of looks like a few things, it sounds like a few things, it feels like a few things. I'd say it looks like acting out. It looks like depression. It looks like doing things to stimulate, to get us beyond our feeling low, instead of just feeling connected to ourselves and having that be something that we're content with. It's something that we're energized about. I've heard of plenty of athletes and religious leaders and politicians and famous people who seem to have all kinds of stuff who then self-sabotage. All of a sudden they're in the news for some kind of stealing something or some kind of drug-related charges or something violence or being a sexual predator. And we think, oh my God, this person was like a minister who was so known for railing against abuse. Even there was some politician, I believe in Florida, who had legislation passed about stalking on internet, and this guy was stalking. We certainly know about clergy abuse and all these other things where when people seem to be together, but really they are acting out in different ways that we know. So it looks like self-sabotage, it looks like career-ending decisions. Felitti would say that that these people are they're dealing with this illness. It's not a disease. It's something that's not well in them. And so self-sabotage looks like these different things. It sounds like what I call this stinking thinking. A couple things related to victimization and abuse that I've heard people say is that they or at least wonder if they caused what happened to them. That they wonder how responsible they were. And so self-sabotage is when we start latching onto this responsibility for what happened to us when we were vulnerable, when we didn't have a language, when we didn't have a network of support, when we didn't know about sexuality or about boundaries, is taking responsibility for things that were not our responsibility. We can take and must take responsibility for now. But the self-sabotage thinking is to reach back and to think that we're responsible for all of that. And so as this image of the stairs and the walls, we make our life one big uphill struggle with no easy corners, nowhere to really rest. So give yourself a break and let go of some of that thinking. Another kind of self-sabotage sounds like is when people not just take responsibility, but they unload that it was God's will somehow, that the things that happen must have been ordained or somehow God allowed this to happen. And again, this is a terrible way to get ourselves nuts, to start to think that God wanted us to suffer. Really, God wants us to be fully alive, and there are plenty of theologians from different traditions who will recognize that. To be our best selves, we need to be fully alive. And self-sabotage feels stifling. Really, we may have put up with all kinds of stuff, but we can start to recognize now as adults that those different ways that we were treated were deforming, and that to the degree that we had to conform to other people's expectations, that was not helpful for us. And so self-sabotage takes shape in many ways. And I'll just ask you at this point, what's it worth to you at this point to change those behaviors, to change that thinking, and to recognize the way you feel? This is a critical piece, because when someone asked me that, I was in a conference to be a community organizer and learning all these skills, and someone said, what is keeping you from doing what you said you want to do? And I was challenged. I said, it's me. I have to believe that I am responsible for creating what I want. I have to demand that of myself. And so what do you see for yourself that's the hole in the sidewalk? And where do you see yourself along this path? So go to the chat room, work with the exercises in the workbook, and work with other people. Share, learn from other people's experiences, that we can move beyond getting stuck in our self-sabotaging behavior.